How's it going? My name is Jess and this is Reason. Today we will be discussing the atrocious autumn statement with Elliot Keck, who is the investigations campaign manager for the Taxpayers Alliance. Let's get the conversation going. So, what does the autumn statement announce?
Well, the autumn statement is a pretty sweeping set of policy changes on the spending and the taxation side. Both of them contain some real shockers for people of this country, unfortunately. On the taxation side, the Chancellor has been very, very clever and he's positioned himself so that he's not breaking any explicit manifesto commitments, or not breaking many at least. And to some extent that is a good thing. A manifesto is an agreement with the public when you get elected, but nevertheless, when you look into the small print, this is pretty bad. So we're looking at a freezing of almost all tax thresholds. So that's income tax threshold. So that's the rate at which you begin paying tax, you begin paying a higher level of tax, and you begin paying an even higher level of tax. And when you have inflation at a very, very high level and people are then asking for pay rises inevitably to compensate for that inflation, then you're going to get more and more people dragged into the different rates of tax. So that's going to be possibly a part-time worker at a supermarket that currently does not pay any tax, but when you see an increase to their pay in order to reflect inflation, suddenly they will start paying some tax on their income. That will mean that people like nurses at the higher rate of pay, or police officers or teachers, completely normal middle income people, not people that we think of as particularly wealthy, who are on maybe £50,000, who then get pay rises, will then be dragged into that 40p rate. And then also inheritance tax, capital gains tax, dividends tax. I mean, really a full range of taxes people are going to be dragged into them. So if house prices go up, for example, or if people's inheritances go up a bit, then people will start paying more on them. So that's some of the tax ranges. And then you've got a whole load of other bits and pieces. Electric car drivers are going to start having to pay tax, which, I mean, some people may see as a good thing, the anti-Tesla types, but we're against vehicle excise duty. So of course we're against that across the board. And one real nasty one that has only come out in the last couple of hours is that fuel duty is going to be hiked up by possibly as much as sort of 20%. Is pretty grim. On the spending side, then you've got, you'd think you'd have spending cuts, right? You'd think that if they're going to announce all these tax rises, at least they'd get the cost of government under control, but we're seeing very little evidence of that. So they're sticking with the triple lock. Benefits are going up. There's more money for the NHS, more money for education, more money really across the board. And some people will welcome that, but for us, we want to see government spending come down. And at the moment, it's going to be about 47% of GDP within the next year or two. And I think that's a pretty shockingly high figure.
How would you respond to the argument that these tax rises would be worth it as long as public spending is supporting the most vulnerable, for example, with triple up pensions or spending to the NHS? I think many people in this country might have this mentality that, taxes might increase, but also we need to protect the vulnerable. How would you respond to that?
I think it's an entirely reasonable position, but it's not a position I think that is currently based in the reality of the figures. So we have a tax burden that is already at a 70-year high and will be at a 75-year high as a result of these measures. It's not like we are dealing with a very low tax system in which actually health spending is suffering, and we haven't spent money on health in recent years. That is just not the case. We've seen NHS spending balloon over recent years, and by the middle of this decade, I think it's going to be around 50% of day-to-day expenditure will be on the health service, and the risk is we end up with a health service with a country attached to it, and I think that's incredibly concerning. So I entirely accept the argument. We want really well-funded, really well-run public services, and that's going to be supported by the taxation system. But currently, the balance is absurdly weighted towards public services and away from tax, and away from allowing people to keep more money in their own pocket. And if you don't allow people to keep money in their pocket, you're not going to get the entrepreneurialism, you're not going to get the innovation that will produce the economic growth to pay for these services in the long term. So, I take the argument, but I don't think it's based on the reality at the moment.
How do you think this compares to Liz Truss's economic plan, which was more libertarian, but I think that was more seen as a disaster by the British public?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the Liz Truss plan, in a sense, both plans have their good and bad bits, right? So this Hunt plan, it does talk about spending restraint, albeit not for a few years, and that's very worrying, because if you kick things into the long grass, and inevitably they get shelved later down. But you do see at least some positive language and some long-term plans on bringing spending down. What you don't really see is anything serious on the taxation front. The Liz Truss plan was almost the reverse, really. You saw these very, very radical and bold taxation policy changes, not as bold and radical as I think some people claim, but some positive stuff. But at the same time, there was absolutely no indication that how they were going to bring spending down in order to balance the books. And in fact, they announced a spending plan an energy plan that could have cost up to £150 billion. So listen, they both have their good and bad bits. Ideally, I suppose you could say that actually, if you combine the two of them in some sense, if you had the bold taxation policy of the Liz Truss government that looks at keeping corporation tax at competitive level, that looks at cutting income tax, and et cetera, and then you combine that with a serious long-term plan to bring down spending, which is included in at least part of today's announcement, then you may end up getting the best of both worlds. But I do fear at the moment we may be having the worst of both worlds instead.
So could you go into more detail on what you would like to see the government do in terms of the economy, in terms of taxation and public spending?
Yeah, so I think that the government does need to start taking spending seriously. I think take for example the triple lock. This is a policy that was brought in 2010, and there's an incredibly generous system for pensioners. It means it goes up in line with earnings, inflation, or 2.5%. Of course, we want pensioners to be well looked after, but pensioners have seen one of the biggest increases in incomes and living standards, and one of the biggest falls in poverty over the last 15 years or so. Seeing figures well better for the rest of the population, and at the same time they retire at an age which is again arguably too low given our life expectancy. So I think serious actions on pensions and retirement age would have been worth looking at. I think we also need to look at practices in the civil service, whether it's the amount of annual leave they get, whether it's the fact that they're not turning up to the office but they're still expecting the London waiting allowance, they're still expecting the fancy offices. Whether it's just general waste and clamping down on some of these, weird and bizarre and woke cultural schemes, which I'm sure your viewers and listeners will be absolutely irate about, whether it's the hundreds of thousands of pounds on rainbow painted crossings and the like. And listen, a variety of other systems. On tax, we want to see a reduction in tax. I mean, listen, clearly the Truss administration possibly tried to do too much too soon. Maybe she should have just stuck with not increasing corporation tax and cancelling the national insurance rise. But in the long term, we'd like to see a taxation burden that's brought down to closer to sort of 30% of GDP rather than currently the sort of 36%, or be sort of 37, 38% as a result of this budget that it is at the moment.
My final question is, do you think this will ruin the Conservative Party's reputation completely as the party of fiscal responsibility and low tax?
Listen, we don't really pass judgment on the politics of the situation. I mean, the Conservatives claim to be a party that tends to prefer low tax and a small state. The evidence in the last few years, at least, has not really been there. One can hope that they are viewing this autumn statement as the beginning of a longer term plan to get the public finances under control, to put them in a position where they can cut tax and bring the state down to a lower level. And that's certainly what we have to hope. But I mean, listen, their reputation has not been particularly good in recent months and years, and I think they will have to do a lot to recover it.
Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to Elliot for joining me on this video. Please like, comment and subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.